Hi, everybody. Welcome, and I'm so glad you're joining us today for our special webinar with Dr. Peter Levine. And we're going to be introducing a course coming up pretty soon called Healing Sexual Trauma, a somatic and attachment approach to working with therapy clients that Peter will be doing, and I'll be hosting, and I'll be answering questions, and it'll be a great time that we'll have together on that. It's coming up soon. But today, we're doing a free webinar with all of you. We're so glad you're joining us on the topic of sexuality, life, energy, and trauma. Of course, many of you are familiar with Peter. He's well renowned as the developer of somatic experiencing. He's won the Lifetime Achievement Award for United States Association of Body Psychotherapists, as well as the Rhys Davis Chair for his lifetime contribution to infant and child psychiatry, and many, many other things. He's written several books you can find on Amazon. He started out with Waking the Tiger, which has been really popular worldwide, and many, many books followed that. So I'm really excited to introduce him today. And I'm Diane Poole, for those of you who don't know me. I've worked with Peter for, a great, well, we're still working together, obviously, it's been like 25, 30 years now. I'm the dinosaur of somatic experiencing, as Peter calls me. And I also do a lot of work with attachment, dynamic attachment repatterning experience. And we both work heavily with somatic and developmental strategies. So I'm really, again, happy to be with all of you today. And we're going to be kind of diving into some of the issues with this very sensitive topic that so many of us are dealing with in private practice. It's a major complex issue that many of us confront every day in our offices. So, Peter, is there something you'd like to start out with to start us off?
Maybe so. Actually, I was looking to find a title of a CD. That was when CDs were the new technology for Sounds True, called Sexual Healing, Transforming the Sacred Wound. And the thing that I really like to take from that is it is about healing a sacred wound. It really goes to the deepest part of our spirit, even our identity. And it has to be approached very delicately in therapy. And there are many pitfalls that can occur in working with sexual trauma. I assume, we'll be later in the program, we'll be talking in some detail about these. But one of the things I think two things that are overarching. Sexual aliveness is a spiritual experience. It really is. And so how do we help the person recover that which may have been, I don't want to say lost, but may have been overwhelmed by different experiences? And another thing in this course that's going to be really important is assumptions that therapists make about a client and about sexual healing, sexual trauma, and sexual healing. You know, in teaching classes regarding this and in doing case consultation with different therapists, I've noticed that there can be a two-sided tendency. One is for the therapist almost to have a prurient interest in the details of a sexual trauma.
Getting kind of obsessed with that.
Yes.
And digging too deep, which I think you've mentioned so many times can be harmful. I did want to mention to people that are listening, we do have, if you hit your Q&A button, you can ask questions, and I will kind of bring them in to Peter as it feels like appropriate. Just I wanted to mention that. And also, if you're having any technical problems, you want to go to the chat button, and you'll go directly to our tech team. And also, there will be a replay of this webinar for the next several days, and usually it's ready. We usually edit it, have to upload it and everything, usually ready within 24 to 48 hours, if not sooner.
Yeah. Well, anyhow, I was saying, again, there can be the over-approaching of the issue by the therapist, or an avoidance by the therapist because of our own issues and our own insecurity with our knowledge of how to work with sexual trauma. So if it comes up, we can very subtly and unconsciously direct the session in a different direction. So those are really important points, I think, for us as therapists. I assume that are most of the people here therapists, or
Yes,
also
our
here?
audience, well, I mean, there might be some other people that
Yeah.
joined and registered, but our predominant audience are professionals that have a
Okay.
lot of experience. So what you're
Yeah.
giving them is all that more important to refine things and to add to their knowledge
Yeah.
base.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's certainly one thing. And also, the therapist has to be comfortable enough with their own sensuality, their own sexuality, and their own life energy. They're really different aspects of the same. Um,
Sort of vitality or
yeah, vitality. It really is about vitality, sexual aliveness and vitality. I mean, sometimes you meet a person. I think it's fairly rare though. And you just say, oh my gosh, this person is really alive. They're really present. They're really in their bodies. And they're comfortable in their bodies. And when you're comfortable in your bodies, you're also going to be much more comfortable in your sexuality and your sensuality. And that's another thing, I think, because our culture is so sexually obsessed. I mean, quite frankly, if you're watching a movies or the television, I don't, in a way, I don't know how anybody in our culture could have a healthy sexuality, because the models are so perverted.
so much violence mixed
So
in.
much violence and rage, and it's maybe all the things that you don't want, the things that one sees on a regular basis. So anyhow, for therapists to really know how to work with trauma, not head on. There's an example that I gave. I think I gave it in Waking the Tiger, actually. The myth of Medusa. And Medusa, she's the Gorgon with all of the snakes, hair for snakes. And her shtick was that she would, anybody who looked into her eyes, she would freeze them into stone, into a statue. So if you go into Athens, all of these statues used to be people before Medusa that them.
Oh.
So anyhow, this Gorgon was really causing so much chaos, so much fear, fear is the word, in the populace, that Perseus, who was a warrior, was tasked to slay her. And so he consulted Athena, that's where the name Athens comes from, Athena. And Athena said, Perseus, whatever you do, don't look into her eyes. Well, so what am I supposed to do? So he thought about this, and he got this idea that he could use his shield, the shield that a warrior has to deflect blows from an enemy sword. So he when he came across Medusa, he looked away. He didn't look directly at her, but he held his shield up so that he could see the reflection of her face. And in doing that, he was able to cut off her head. Now there arose two entities from this, from the wound where the head was cut off. The first was Creosaur, whose name is the warrior with the golden sword, and Pegasus, the winged horse. And we look at those two. Well, the golden sword really is about being able to penetrate with truthfulness, which is again what we strive for in any session. And Pegasus, of course, is the horse with wings. So the horse, very often in dreams and in archetypes, is of the body. of embodiment, of an instinct, but also the wings able to fly and to experience elements of ecstasy and bliss, which again is what's tied into sexual experience. I mean, again, from our media, and we think again as sex as being ejaculation and orgasm, but it's much deeper than that. That's sort of about the plumbing of it. But deep sexuality is about, and this is of course one of the main topics of the program, is about connection, about attaching, about bonding with one, and that really transforming the sexual landscape in a profound ways. Yeah. So using that image to guide us, where do we go? Where do we find the wound? Well, you know, this depends, because many of our clients will have experienced very early sexual trauma, sexual abuse, molestation. Sometimes as early as 2 years old. And then I believe that that children, that is to say, all children from the age of 2 to 17, have experienced sexual trauma, significant sexual trauma. That's about, I think, 40%. This is what I recall, and I think that's about right. It was about 40%. And I imagine, well, my experience is that with women it's considerably higher. So sexual trauma is by no means something that only occurs to a small number of people. And again, we have to see how we're going to define sexual trauma, whether it's molestation, whether it's rape, whether it's very often seductiveness on the part of one of the parents or both of the parents. And it can be so confusing because, again, it gets tied up with so many different things. But I can't hear you. I can't hear Diane. She's talking.
Be unmuted.
Oh,
it
now
really,
I can.
no, I got it. It really invades our whole developmental history.
Exactly. And our
Almost
whole
every
development.
Yeah.
Right. And also our developmental history is really important in understanding healthy sexual development. So, you know, in a way, it doesn't make sense to try to heal sexual trauma if we don't know how healthy sexuality develops in children and then in adolescence.
So we need to go deep into reviewing both of those things.
That's right. We really need to look at the developmental processes when we become sensitized to a gender, when we identify with a gender. And I know things are a lot more complicated than they were, you know, some years ago. And because, again, some of these relationships are heterosexual, some are homosexual, and some are what sometimes is called gender fluidity. And I'm afraid that, I mean, I've worked with a few people who identified themselves in this way, but I really don't know a lot about it because when I was working with clients, it was way before that. So I want to kind of apologize beforehand and just to acknowledge that's not something I know a lot about. But I do believe that my experience has been that some of these general principles, not all of them, apply to all gender identification and homosexual and so forth. So again, it's this sacredness that I think in a way unites the work that we do with our clients.
That's so beautiful. I have a couple questions. Would you like me to give you a few? Shell's asking, do you have any suggestions for how to work with uncomfortable trauma-infused fantasies that come up as a result of someone that's been sexually abused as a child? And her client's not acting any of these fantasies out, but they're somewhat disturbing, I'm guessing.
Yeah. Well, you know, fantasies in general, it's a really good question. Fantasies in general can be very productive in psychotherapy. I think Freud recognized this, although his interpretation unfortunately got off the mark rather a bit. But if one can can work with fantasies, again, in a very gradual, titrated way. And if the person has the capacity, again, you don't want to work with clients' fantasies if they don't have enough of an observing presence. They're able to observe that this is a fantasy, although it can bring up difficult feelings and difficult emotions and also important information. So, so I will generally, make sure, and I say, well, I'm glad you brought this up. I think there's something really valuable in this that we can learn from. If it feels okay for you right now, to explore this fantasy a little bit more deeply, and just to see what we can cull from this, what we can gain from this. So I try to put it in a positive way, frame it in a positive way, because it really is. And again, a lot of times this brings up major shame. And then we have to know how to work with shame. And I'm sure that in later sessions, of course, I'll be teaching some tools for working with shame. But shame becomes, shame at any age. And shame begins probably around 8. The proto-shame really starts around 18 months. And then it has a different presentation at different ages. And then shame becomes explosive in early adolescence and adolescence, especially where kids are forming into groups, into cliques. And you see that as varies, especially with girls around that age, where, somebody will be your best friend, and then boom, all of a sudden they do a Twitter thing or something, or send emails to everyone and saying, they're not my friend anymore. And then you're now my best friend. And this is kind of like an ostracization, which again brings on powerful shame components. So again, in working with the fantasies, we have to also be aware that shame often figures in.
There's another, that's I think really penetrates the whole, one of the most pervasive parts of this is working with that. There's so many parts of it. Jacqueline's asking, how do you suggest working with dissociative disorder caused by severe sexual trauma?
Yeah. Well, very slowly, very gently. There are different ways of working with DID. And some of those are what I call ego state therapies, parts therapies, internal family systems therapies. And that can be valuable. Although sometimes I've seen it getting it becomes just a thing of itself, and it tends to just go on and on and on. But the key in working with parts is to begin to be able to have them communicate with each other, and not just have more and more parts, but to get the parts to begin to communicate with each other. And I think that is a valid approach. And I know a lot of people do excellent work on that. Ona Vanderhart and Niehaus have a couple of books on that were very good. Kathy Steele, another person, excellent book. My approach is different. My approach is more that we all have different parts, for sure. But again, my premise, but that we do basically have one body that holds all of those parts. So when we're able to work with the bodily sense, with the bodily felt sense, then we can begin to unite these fragmented parts. And again, this has to happen very slowly, because if you bring these parts together too quickly, there can be an explosive release of energy. And again, the idea here is we want to make sure that the person, well, in any trauma work, but especially with sexual healing, that the person is not overwhelmed by that release of energy.
And you
So
have
again,
so
it's,
many things you suggest to avoid re-traumatization in the way that you're working.
yes, absolutely. And particularly in how to work with the different memories that start to come up. And again, these are very frequently haunting to the person, and there's a desperate need to remember. Something just keeps slipping away, and they try to grab onto it, to hold on to it. And so rather than looking for an answer of what the truth is of what happened, we look at how the body has responded in terms of what are called implicit memories or procedural memories. And again, this is such a complicated uh, area. Actually, my latest book was written really to help people understand the differences between different memory systems and how to work with them differently. And that's, I forget,
Trauma and memory.
right, trauma and memory, brain and body, and the search for the living past, so how the past lives in us. So how to work with these procedural memories, they're sometimes called body memories. And out of that, let the more explicit memories begin to emerge out of that. And so very often we really need to, and again, in a very gentle way, kind of restrain the person from jumping into cognition, from jumping into, oh, this must have been what happened, and so forth. But to be able to stay with those body sensations, which are the procedural memories, long enough for something to emerge from that. And, and again, that's something that most therapists, I think, have a somewhat limited understanding. I mean, of course, people have studied SE and other approaches, I'm sure, as well, how important it is not to get over-identified with the denouement, saying, okay, I know this is what happened. And believe me, and of course, I mean, just looking at the statistics, the majority of and the therapeutic population, the majority of the people that we see have experienced sexual trauma of different kinds throughout their lives. So, and how to work with that so the person isn't overwhelmed, isn't shamed, and then can move through some of these sensations. And again, the idea is not just to process them. Well, I mean, it is to process them, of course, but it is to come to a healthy sexuality. I was working with this one woman, and she was sexually abused by a high school teacher. Or no, she was 13, so it must have been junior high school teacher. And one of the things that made it so complicated and difficult was that she fell in love with him, because that's what 13-year-old girls and boys do. They fall in love. And so, so how could she untangle that from this being consensual, loving relationship, even though he ultimately rejected her, I think because he was, of course, afraid of getting caught. So, so again, this is, depending on what age it happens, we have to also look at the developmental unfolding at that age. It's really, really important. And again, at the age of 12 and 13, it's really about, I mean, of course, you're still with groups, same-sex groups generally. And, but then there's beginning of flirting. And I distinguish playful flirting, which is playful. Mm-hmm. And the kind of flirting which we see again in the movies, which is seduction. It's not really flirting. It's not this gentle getting to know you, getting to feel who you are, getting to know who your friends are. So again, we want to look at the ages at which sexual trauma might have occurred, and sometimes the developmental fixations will take us in this direction. As well often as the other question was, again, often understanding the nature of fantasies and being able to delve into them and to explore them a bit.
And I think just to highlight how important it is to track sensation and allow procedural memory to arise out of your own body wisdom, the client's body wisdom.
That's right.
That's
Yeah.
so important.
Yeah.
Mia had asked a little bit about clients that don't have memories, but they think they have sexual abuse, and then where therapists see no evidence or they do see evidence. I think your answer about tracking the sensation addresses that quite a bit.
Yes, yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. Now, again, this has to be done in a very clear way where the person is not overwhelmed or underwhelmed. What I mean by underwhelmed is shut down. So we need always to be able to have our clients be in the mid-arousal range. And again, when you're working with difficult material, not just sexual trauma, but difficult material, it's not so easy to stay in that inner range. So most people either be hyper-aroused, hyper-vigilant, and so forth, or will be shut down with somatic symptoms. And again, one of the characteristics of sexual trauma, or the sequelae of sexual trauma, is our physical symptoms that sometimes masquerade as illnesses. And though that doesn't necessarily mean that the person has been traumatized, you begin again to have in your mind that it's possible. But again, it's in our mind, and I kind of put it on the shelf behind me. So if at a later time we need to address it, then I know it's there. So again, the therapist, me as a therapist, I as a therapist need not to be either impelled or compelled.
Right, right. There's someone asking about symptoms I wanted to share with you.
Sure.
Kimberly's mentioning that she's been she's a master of social work, and she has some symptoms. She had sexual abuse at an early age, and she's constantly clenched in her glutes, thighs, jaw, and shoulders. Could this be the result? Is it treatable? I know we're going to say yes to that. I then went to combat in the Army and can't shake the somatic results despite therapy and much effort.
Oh, okay. Well, so if I understand, yeah, sexual trauma, then followed by, I assume, some kind of military
Army,
trauma.
yeah,
Army
combat.
trauma.
Went to
Yeah,
combat in the Army.
how to untangle that one. You know, in general, again, this is in general. Again, I don't know how I work with a client until we're together in the room, sitting in chairs, being with each other. But my guess in general, if you have something like that, I would probably first try to address the military trauma. But again, it's very likely, and again, who knows? Because again, a lot of women were sexually abused in the military, so there may be a connection from that. But I would say it's again, military trauma can be complicated. And then there are issues depending on, whether people were affected by these explosive devices or saw people injured, dismembered, dying. It's interesting that when in military trauma, that people tend to be more traumatized when they see somebody else injured as opposed to themselves being injured. And then often again, of course, there's survivor's guilt, because if you've lost people that you know, or even people that know people that that were lost, there's this part that says something like, why them?
We lost your microphone.
Oh, you lost my mic?
No, it just you just put it closer to your mouth again. That's all.
Oh, okay. Is that okay now?
Yes.
Yeah. So again, my likelihood would be to, again, just find out what life for the person is right now, and what kinds of symptoms they're having. And again, with all trauma, you tend to work with it in layers like the onion peel. So again, if the therapy isn't working, Kimberly, I would first bring it up in a session, and then maybe that person is not the best therapist for you at this time. Hard to know. So I can't give any really specific feedback except to say, gosh, we all deserve to work with people who can hold us, can help us move through these hauntings, through these symptoms, through these hauntings.
Thank you so much. One of the things that during the course we'll be showing some recordings of Peter working with clients. So I think that'll give you some ideas of what's possible when somebody's either excessively overstimulated, overactivated, or they're excessively shut down, and how to work with those extreme states. So I think that's something that's one of the heart parts of the course, the heart of the course.
Mm-hmm. The heart of the course, right.
And then Mia was asking how you invite people to talk about their sexuality in general, people who don't even say the word sex.
Right.
How do we support? There's a lot of repression. How do we get to a healthy expression, and modeling openness and welcoming?
Right. Yeah. Well, there's the story of the person who went through their analysis, and then they said to a friend, now I can say FK to my MOTHER.
That's great. Oh.
Yeah, again, all of these things are in some kind of a relational context. And it's very frequently, for example, the child is being molested, let's just say a girl child by a father. But the mother knows that something is going on there, and that she doesn't step in to protect the child. So that really deepens the wound, because that's not the way it's supposed to happen. I mean, it's not supposed to happen at all. But at least the adult should be there and to saying, sweetheart, this is not your fault, and we're going to change this. I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen. I mean, that's what the child needs to hear. And again, in these complicated situations, that frequently they don't hear that, especially like one spouse is afraid of being left. And so they won't bring anything up. They won't stand up for the child. What was the question again? I think
talking about how that's okay. How to bring up a discussion of sexuality.
Yeah. Sometimes again, when working with the person, or even sometimes in the beginning, sort of like a checklist of of symptoms of what people want to accomplish, and I think at the right time it's completely appropriate to ask, well, things like, how would you describe your relationship with anger? How would you describe your relationship with sexuality? So I'll put it in with other things as well, so it's not just sexuality.
That sounds like a really good idea. There's a gentleman from France, from Marseille, who's asking about how you deal with amnesia around in the United States. Very difficult in France to talk about forgotten trauma. His other question was that sometimes it's difficult in France to talk about female abusers, which of course happens too.
Yep.
And he's asking us how we're doing on this side of the Atlantic. We're hanging in. Thank you.
Right.
we're hanging in.
We're holding our breath for a couple of years. So amnesia. Of course, amnesia is very common, and it's a form of dissociation. But at the same time, there is no such thing as amnesia, because the body remembers, the body knows. And again, to be a little bit careful about this. Some people think, well, okay, if I have this body sensation, then this must be true. And it doesn't work like that. It works with being able to enter into these procedural memories. The person who was talking about physically about their jaw being tight, about their shoulders or their neck, those are procedural memories. Those are things that the body tried to do at one time to get away from the source of the threat or the abuse. And it then has become chronic. So we work with those tension patterns. So for example, let's just say a very simple example. Person has chronically tense shoulders. Again, I'm not saying this is exclusively with sexual trauma or even mainly with sexual trauma, but any kind of trauma, the person chronically is like this. So what I may do is do an exercise where I have them feel the tension that's in the shoulders and very, very slowly begin to tighten the shoulders even more so they begin to move up towards the ear. Slowly, 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 and then letting them fall down as much as they can. And then pause for a minute, notice sensations, feelings, thoughts. And then again, slowly, 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 even slower than this, so you can at least see it, and then coming down, slowly, slowly, slowly. So you're working, I think this person described tightening in their jaw, tightening in their shoulders, in their glutes, and in their abdomen. You know, Wilhelm Reich, this is a big part of his understanding, and I've definitely learned a lot from studying his work, for sure. And you know, it's interesting when Reich talked about an orgasm, it talked about having this excitation, but the rest of the body actually relaxing into the sensation. And when Masters and Johnson did their observational research, their human ethology, they described the orgasm as actually tightening at the moment of orgasm, actually tightening the belly and tightening the glutes. And I think tightening the neck and the jaw. And so it's exactly the opposite. That was what Reich described as an armored response. Now, again, I think, unfortunately, Reich described every symptom, every neurosis to sexual repression or sexual trauma, sexual abuse. And that's definitely not true. And I think that was the weakness in his work. But his understanding about what healthy sexuality looks like, and we have to kind of separate the wheat from the chaff there. And there's a lot of important insights that he really brings to therapy.
Well, Julietta was asking if you suggest any author or particular book on about healthy sexual development that they can read.
Gosh. I'm actually in the process of beginning to write a book on healthy sexuality for adolescents. And a book on healthy sexuality, oh my gosh.
Might have to do an Amazon search.
Yeah, well, yeah, there's one guy, and I cannot remember his name. He's a little bit over the top, and he sounds like a Reichian, about healthy sexuality. You know, we did a little bit of a search for that, and I don't think I've found really very much anything. If any of you in the audience knows of a good book on healthy sexuality and cultivating healthy sexuality. And again, you know, if the parents have not had a healthy sexuality, they're not going to be able to support their children in that way. And this kind of begins, again, from a very early age.
And so much of it, you've talked about like embodied aliveness and embodied sensuality as a starting point.
That's right. Yeah, for sure. But I mean, think about this. When a toddler is being toilet trained, if it's harsh, then the child learns to contract their gluteal muscles and their anus, you know, and that develops as a pattern, and that then blocks the sexual energy. So again, this is so important to understand the big picture, and that takes and that's a seasoned therapist is able to do that.
You know, Joanne's, I think that's true. And Joanne has talked about something that you wrote in one of your books about sexual practicing of young children.
Mhm.
And she's asking, that keeps bumping around here. She's asking if there was severe neglect and violence and no opposite sex attachment figure, could this practicing behavior be stifled or delayed?
Oh yeah, yeah, of course.
Of course.
No, absolutely, absolutely. You know, again, this is a natural process. It's an organic process. It's an unfolding, developmental unfolding. And whenever there's trauma anywhere along the line, and again, not just not just sexual trauma, that developmental process gets distorted. And then everything after that carries on with that distortion. So again, we don't want to hyper focus on the sexual trauma. At the same time, we don't want to deflect or ignore it.
Of course. I think that's a great response. Thank you. And Sarah's asking, do you have any insights on healing sexual abuse and porn addiction?
Oh, God. Well,
which unfortunately is so accessible these days.
yeah, yeah, it's so accessible. I mean, apparently beyond belief. You know, yeah, basically, sex ed in the United States is about pornography. That's where kids learn about sex. That is not sexuality. That is certainly not healthy sexuality. It's a horrible, horrible thing. And it leads to so much pain and unnecessary suffering. But that's what kids have because they don't get healthy sex education in schools. It's different in Europe. You know, in working on this book, I interviewed a couple of recent graduates from high school, young women, two young women, wonderful young women, very, very aware family, very conscious family. And they would describe, I asked them to describe basically their sex ed. And I think starting in the 5th grade, they begin with, the anatomy kinds of things, where babies come from. And then in middle school, they have a course where and the teacher is trained specifically to do this. They have a room where there are a number of tables, and there are 4 chairs on each table. And there are 2 boys and 2 girls at each of and again, with different gender things, it could of course be different, but that's the way, that's the way it was described to me. And they work with relating. How do you relate to boys, how do girls to girls, how do boys to girls, girls to boys relate? And so again, you're taking this step by step in a way that's appropriate. And I don't know how it is in France, but it's really, sex ed is just stifling here. I mean, or non-existent. And yeah.
So kids are raised in an area of ignorance, and then they're getting this input that's really distorted.
Exactly. So which one are they going to go with? Well, they're going to, they're going to go with and it's an interesting thing when I would work in different cultures to get an idea of the type of sex that people really are exposed to. I'll go to one of those things where you put in a couple of quarters or something like that, and then you see a little bit of a movie. And when I started teaching in Switzerland, the Germanic cultures, it was so harsh and sadomasochistic. And that really was a reflection of the type of character structure in that culture and that time. So yeah. I mean, and parents have nothing to say about this. They really can't stop their kids from doing it. And of course, the kids are so much more savvy on, with technology that, it's there. But if there's nothing to counter that really is life positive, that is sex positive, that's what kids are going to learn about. And then instead of being in connection, like I described in the Switzerland, they all on their phones. And they could be 4 people at a table, and all 4 of them are, and I don't know, are they texting each other or are they texting other people? I don't know. But it's not about connection, obviously. And connection has to be there with another person in the flesh, communicating with our voice, with our tones, with our eyes, with our bodily expressions, to communicate with people of that, in this way that really will underlie healthy sexual development.
Amber's asking, how can a client reconnect to their body and presence when they're being intimate with their partner, that it's consensual, but they tend to disconnect and
Right,
dissociate?
right. Yeah. No, of course, I work with many couples in this regard. And I'm thinking of this one couple that I did some work with recently. And she was just starting to connect with her feelings of actually being abused by the teacher. And whenever her husband would go anywhere near her to touch her, she would immediately withdraw in revulsion, disgust and revulsion. And so, I mean, and they were both devastated, and he didn't know what to do. And she felt guilty, of course, but she just couldn't do it because it would just made her feel like throwing up. So they were sitting in 2 chairs, and I say I wasn't really getting anywhere with them, and I said, I'm going to suggest something to do, and it's risky. It's risky, but if you're willing to try this, and they both agree, I mean, I think they were both, and I had her sit with her back against the chair, and then just being supported by his legs. And when she was ready, to have him put his hands on her shoulders. And then just tears started coming down her, both of their eyes, especially from hers. And it's like, oh my God, this is what I needed. I needed to feel what safe touch and safe holding actually feels like. And then I referred them to a therapist, because I only do this very short-term work, to continue in that work, with that work.
And she opened such a beautiful door.
Yeah, right, exactly. The door was opened at least.
They could have hope for the possibilities of just gradually expanding that as she was ready and as he was ready.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, we have so many fantastic questions, and there's no way we're going to get to all of them. They're just all fantastic, and it's impossible to choose what. I'm just kind of going in order, but more or less. But for any of you, those of you that decide to sign up on for the course, if you could retype your questions in the private Facebook group. We won't be able to transfer them. We can't copy them and paste them, but if you could retype them, then we'll try to get to these questions in the private Facebook group, for those of you that decide to join the course. I just will take one more question here. There's so she's talking about how do you approach a male client that complains about being excessively in turn-on mode that kind of interferes with his normal daily functioning. He just can't and he feel very ashamed about it.
Yeah. Again, looking developmentally, a lot of times children, both boys and girls, try to release tension by masturbation. And that's again, being curious about masturbation again is a normal developmental process. But then it kind of takes an edge when the person is, because of what's going on in the family, is so dysregulated that the only way they can get a hint of release is through masturbation. And of course, it is not uncommon that people who have had sexual trauma also excessively masturbate.
Or they go anorexic, one way or the other.
Or go anorexic, right. Though again, the hyper or hypo, That's right. They either anorectic and avoidant and anorectic, or compulsive in masturbation. And sometimes, and this is particularly what I discovered when I was working with men, and it was very common actually. I would ask them to reduce the masturbation, a little bit at a time, and to journal what kind of sensations and feelings they were feeling when they didn't masturbate. And so using that, they were able to gradually masturbate less and less, and then be able to work with those feelings and those arousal states that were underneath the masturbation. But it's very common that people use their masturbation to try to downregulate, and then also as a way of avoiding healthy sexuality when you're in a relationship. It's like looking at being addicted to pornography or masturbation. I don't know if addicted is the right term, but it's over relying on that. And again, it withdraws the people from healthy sexuality.
Fantastic. I didn't know if you had any. One person was asking about circumcision, and if you had what you might say about that.
Oh gosh, yeah. Well, the American Pediatrics Association at one time, I think they withdrew it, unfortunately, said that that the circumcision was an unnecessary and mutilating procedure. And I agree. Now, it's done somewhat differently now, where the baby is held and they hopefully use some kind of anesthetic. But I remember being at a bris. It was a Jewish family, and they circumcised the baby, and the baby was screaming and crying, and then they put the baby in the crib, the infant in the crib, and it stopped crying. And so they were talking about, it doesn't really bother them. So I went up kind of while they were, having their little food bits. I went up and I held the baby. And the baby then started to take a breath and started to cry, and I soothed the baby, and then the baby was relaxed. But it definitely can be traumatizing. I know, of course, there are religious reasons, and all I can say again is that if it is done, it should be done where the child is being held safely, and where at least some kind of local anesthetic is used to reduce the physical pain.
Absolutely. Yeah, really, really touchy topic, given all the parameters of that.
Sure.
Well, I think, again, we are going to have question and answer segments to each of the calls that we have coming up. There'll be 5 calls, and Peter will be on all of them except one because of his schedule, but and I will be on them to answer these continual questions, and we'll be also doing teaching during the calls, of course. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of the Healing Sexual Trauma course. And it's a somatic and attachment approach to working with therapy clients that Peter and I will be doing. And in session 1, we're going to be looking at Peter's teachings on sexuality, development, and erotic energy. He'll be talking about mother-child co-regulation. I know there were some questions about different gender sensitivities. He'll be talking a little bit about that. And how it's important that we have a broader range of understanding sexuality than heterosexuality, but we understand that as well as homosexuality and all of the different gender fluidity possibilities. And then in session 2, Peter's going to be we'll be showing you an actual client demo with Peter working with someone that has a kind of too much activation, right? They're hyperactivated, their sympathetic nervous system's on too high, and he helps her with grounding and moving from sort of a hyper aggressive kind of energy to a more healthy aggression, always working with the VU sound and other ways that you'll see him actually in action, which I think is so valuable. I think that's one of the most
Yeah, I
important parts
agree.
of the
I think
course.
that's the most important part of the course, actually, because we can talk about it, so that's useful, but to really see it then and to sense it while you're seeing it, I think that's where we get the real learning.
And in session 3 and 4, Peter will be teaching the whole hour on, in session 3, reestablishing body connection, grounding and boundaries, and really showing you and talking about answering a lot of the questions that you brought up today that we had a little time to get into, but some that we didn't have time for. So I just want you to know that's there.
Yeah.
And in session 4, a lot about moving, continuing to work with procedural memory, moving from passive to active responses when that's appropriate, and then how do we get from a difficult sexual history to a healthy, mature sexuality. So that will also be really enriching and related to a lot of what people were asking about today too. And again, did you want to say something about that, Peter?
Well, no, I just really encourage people to also keep these questions because,
Yes.
that will help guide us for the rest of the course, because all of the questions were really spot on and kind of got me to bring up things that I might not have brought up otherwise. So please continue with questions.
And also, once you're on the course, you can post them in Facebook, and we can then try to address them as much as we can, either on Facebook or bring it into the teaching weekly call that we're doing. So please don't lose your questions. They've all been really highly relevant and really important. And then in session 5, we're going to be doing another client demo clips from someone that's extremely shut down, and kind of where Peter's showing how you build charge because somebody doesn't have enough of life force, and that to move that into a more physical awareness, but also more ability to move, become mobile instead of immobile, and to access their sense of empowerment and triumph instead of shut down and defeat, and sort of this shame that can also factor in. So we have a lot on the docket here. We're excited to get into this course. I'm very thrilled that we're doing it, and it just has a lot of dimensions to it. So it's exciting that we're going to be diving in very soon. Our first course is April 30th, which is Tuesday coming up. So let's see, I wanted to give you a bit of an overview of what's all contained in the course. So everything you receive in this 5-week course is online, and it's a training course. We'll have questions and answers with both of us, and I think the access to the real client demo sessions, Peter has them as part of the course, and then we also have in the bonus section client sessions from me and client sessions, additional clients pieces of Peter's sessions. He's also giving lots of clinical intervention strategies and case studies as we're moving through the course. And of course, the Q&A part's really important. You'll have complete audio and video recordings as well as transcripts. And there'll be an optional 7 CEs if you're wanting continuing education. There's lots of bonuses, the client demos I mentioned. There's a webinar that Peter and I did together on healing the sacred wound, sexual trauma, healing the sacred wound. That's also packed with valuable information. And then 3 highly effective clinical interventions that Peter uses regularly that really help people come in contact with this embodiment and also this sort of sensuality, and it helps them return to a state of aliveness. So I think it's chock full of good possibilities. Is there anything else you want to say about that, Peter? And then I'll give you a little bit more information before we land.
No, I think that's okay. I think that's
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well then you can kind of see the whole gambit of what we're talking about in the pictures here. It's only $267, or you can do 3 payments for $97. I think there's a link in your chat box from our tech team if there's a way that you can register as soon as you'd like. And there's also this website that you can connect to. That's courses.attachmentmastery.com/healingsexualtrauma/. So courses.attachmentmastery.com/healingsexualtrauma/. Oh my gosh, this has been packed full of great information, and I can't wait to keep the ball rolling. So it's an incredibly sensitive topic, and of course, as you can tell from today, goes in so many different directions. And so I just want you to remember that some people are trying to connect to the site, and it's a little slow right now because everybody's doing it at the same time, but just be patient, you'll get there. And I want you to also remember that this call is on replay for several days until we start around April 30th on a Tuesday. And I find listening to them over and over again is really helpful for me. So I just want you to know that's available. Or if you had to leave the call, or somebody had to leave the call earlier, then you can pick up that information. So we try to make it available to everybody around the world, because this is actually a global endeavor. And I appreciate all of our friends from inside the United States, as well as all the other countries that checked in. And thank you again, Peter, for all of your words of wisdom and also the great questions. And I really appreciate everybody coming together for this today. So thank you, everybody, for making this part of your day, and I really appreciate it. And just keep trying on the link. It's just because we have a lot of people doing it at the same time, and it'll give you more information and hopefully answer all your questions. If you have any other questions, just write us at support@dianepooleheller.com or the link that you see on this page. Okay, everybody, thank you so much. Really enjoyed being with you. And thank you, Peter. It's
Sure.
great to hang out with you and learn from you as well. Okay, we'll see you hopefully very soon. Thanks.